Hi, I'm making this video because Lorraine and I have discussed many world events, and so I have with the other two about how things are with the world and politics and whatnot. I understand one of the most complex things to understand is the Israeli-Palestine conflict that's happening right now. So I'm going to attempt to explain this in the most unbiased way, but it is a lot because it goes back decades within history. So one of the most important things to understand is the idea of what we call anti-Semitism. So when we refer to a Semite, that actually means somebody from the region of the Arab world, but most likely in today's context, we mean a Jewish person. But it does mean the same thing to many other countries around the world. So the idea of being anti-Semitic is to hate somebody based on the fact that they're Jewish, based on the fact that they're different in their customs and whatnot. But often the idea of anti-Semitism gets conflated with the idea of being anti-Israel. So the idea of being anti-Israel means that somebody's against the idea of there being a state or a nation. The idea of state and nation are synonymous with each other. Um, it's difficult to discuss because half of the world doesn't believe Israel is a state or nation that deserves to exist. Half of it does. So the U.S. is of the opinion that Israel is a country of, like that belongs in the UN. But many of the Arab states and many places in Africa and Asia do not believe that Israel has a right to exist. Now, those words sound harsh, but it takes back to learning about the history of Israel and the Jewish people to understand why this is. To understand why it is, we have to go way back in history. So we're talking about anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. And from this, we have to understand why a particular nation or state exists and what that means. So in today's world, we have anywhere between, by different definitions, anywhere between 180 and more countries, where each country has a seat in the United Nations. If you go back 2,000 years ago, that's not the case. There were many different groups who had empires or just systems of people living together with a common way of going about life, a common culture, a common language. And they weren't purely separated by borders, whereas so you have that certain people living together, and if you went like 20 miles outside their borders, you might have another people living together who had a slightly different language but could understand the other people from the place next to them. A good example would be in today's modern world, like if you had somebody from Spain and somebody from Portugal, where they speak Spanish and Portuguese, those two languages are not entirely different. You could probably have somebody talking in Portuguese carrying on a conversation with somebody who's speaking in Spanish, and there may be some confusion, but generally you can understand what each other means. So languages aren't a separate thing, but they're more like a flow, like a what you would call like a spectrum. So people like today in Ukraine and Russia can even understand a little bit what each other's talking about, but they are different languages, but it is on a spectrum. So people you meet on the border might be able to understand a bit of both. Now, going back many years, there is a conflict of whether we look at historical books or the Bible. And sometimes they conflict, sometimes they match. So the history of Jews, like what it means to be Jewish, would relate back into the times of like Joseph. Now, I don't mean the biblical Joseph, like son of the father of Jesus, but rather Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. So there was a guy, Jacob, who had 12 sons. And from the Bible, God renamed Jacob Israel to be the father of the Israelites. And so those are the beginnings of the Jewish people that Jews believe, and also Christians. There's a lot of overlap between what Jews, Christians, and Muslims believe. So Jewish people believe all that's within the Old Testament. Christians, although there are different sects, like different diversions of Christianity, mostly believe what's in the New Testament, with some exceptions. And there are Muslims who believe in the Old Testament, the New Testament, and extra that was handed down from the Prophet Muhammad rather, in the like 700s about. So all these religions are actually very similar to each other in the fact that they all believe in one God, but these minor differences cause a lot of conflict and a lot of wars and a lot of ugliness throughout the years. So the um, the Jews believe that the Israelites, the sons of Jacob and his son, I'm gonna mess this up, but anyway, most of Jacob's sons, yeah, that he had 12 sons, um, formed the basis of what Israelites were, which became the Jews, and they were trapped in Egypt under slavery, and which understood that Moses was an Israelite that led them out of slavery and eventually settled in the land of Canaan, which is now known as Israel, Palestine. So the actual land of Israel is this synonymous with Palestine, Israel, and that's where they believe the Jews to go to. Now, in the Bible, it says that Jews went to that land and then God told them to take it over. And so within that, they killed a lot of people that already lived in that land. So that's automatically problematic because that's the Old Testament is the same as our Bible. So our Bible and both that of what the Jews believe and the Christians believe is that these Jews went into Canaan and basically killed a lot of people for the land, which is not right. Which in my mind, I don't mean to place any beliefs upon people, but like in my mind, that's clearly like not what you're supposed to do. But in the Bible, it said it was God's chosen land, so that's okay. So the Jews believe that their movement into this area was completely okay. Now, what happened since then is they formed kingdoms. Now, the kingdoms are portrayed in the Old Testament in the Bibles of Samuel and King of Kings and a few others after that. And God's law was handed down to these kingdoms in many different forms. For example, many of the laws that Jews follow today are based on those laws. So kosher law is about like what you could eat, not eat, what you can sow in certain fields, and what you can't. Since then, a lot of history has happened. So a lot of history, like different empires. So I'll add that onto this here. So yeah, different empires in the region. Now, some of those you may have heard about, such as Alexander the Great, and there's also Iranian empires, like the Persian Empire and whatnot. So there was a lot of invasions. Now, what happened in that time, along with a lot of invasions, I'm just spelling it out here. So you had the Greeks and the Persians, some other groups as well, like which we don't hear about today. Now, the Persians are basically Iranians. People got split up. So a lot of people got removed from what we consider Israel today, or the Holy Land. So they got moved hundreds of miles away and became slaves to other empires. Slavery was a very common thing back in those days, where an empire somewhere that was stronger or have more money or more resources would take people from that were just like farming and whatnot, farming and hunting and gathering. They would take some of the men and make them slaves for those regions. So Jews got separated. Now, that general separation, what they call, is called the Jewish diaspora. Now, the Jewish diaspora is the spreading of Jews. Now, the word diaspora means like spreading of people. So, I'm going to put all over the world. So, many of the Jews moved to different places in Persia, sometimes in Asia, like the Mongols, and sometimes in Africa, like there were many African Jews. And also, as the New World spread, like a lot of years later, with bringing people to the Americas, Jewish people were also over there. This didn't mean Jews were still in the initial region where they used to be, but like they were mostly spread all over the world. So with this, the language disappeared. So the main language that I'm talking about is, not sure if I'm telling it right, but language disappeared. And that would be Hebrew. So they had still the text, the words from the Hebrew language, and that would be the Old Testament. So the Old Testament is like when you go to church and you read things from the book of Genesis or Exodus or even later, like the words from the prophets Isaiah or Isaac or something like that. Like I don't know if you guys are a prophet, but like you get what I'm saying, like the words of like these dudes, right? So that's from the Old Testament. So that survived, but the actual language didn't get spoken until many, many years later. So those Jews in different regions, I'll say, generally spoke the language of the other people. Of the other people in the land that they moved to. And so did their children and their grandchildren. There is like a slight dialect that developed. So dialect means a language that's kind of like a mix between things. Like for example, um, English people in sorry Americans who speak English in America do not sound exactly the same as English speaking people in Britain and English speaking people in Jamaica. So those are all different dialects. So they perform different dialects. So there was to a certain extent their dialect, which many was a mix between Germanic languages. Germanic languages itself is a mix between different things. For example, English itself is a Germanic language. So Germanic languages will be German, Dutch, who's very close to Germany, but also Denmark, which is above Germany, the Scandinavian languages, which are actually like a sea above that, and England. So all this is kind of mixed up. So English is actually considered Germanic languages, but the dialect that many Jews spoke was between Germanic and Hebrew, and this is known to many people as Yiddish. So Yiddish is written with our own alphabet. It's primarily German, but with like little hints of Hebrew. So Hebrew completely disappeared. So I'm going to add that to my little thing here. So Hebrew basically disappeared. Okay, so that was up to until pretty modern eras. So this happened until late 1800s. Now, the late 1800s in this era was relatively peaceful amongst empires that people tried to get along, tried to held conferences about not taking over different countries because in the 1800s, we had a lot of different things happening on. There was a lot of industrialization, like a lot of factories popped up in England, Germany, France, and the United States. And people realized, like, with all this power, we need to get along. So people come up with different treaties and whatnot. And also, was after the times of Napoleon, which was the early 1800s, when he like kind of ransacked a lot of places, when people realized like they would really need these treaties to get along. But still, within a lot of these empires, became big problems. So I'm going to close this window for a sec and see what's going on next. So same thing. When we clear this. So you had the rise of empires. Now, with the rise of empires came closing, like a lot of what happened in the world. So um, you had in Britain. Now, Britain basically had control of their own land and also part of Ireland, but like not half of Africa, but up to half of Africa, like a lot of different lands, and also India, like major influence in there. So basically, these European languages, the European powers are controlling a lot of part of the world. And the French had like a lot of West Africa, and you had Germany, which was a rising power because it wasn't a empire to begin with. It was a lot of like disconnected like little kingdoms the size of like different counties, like Bergen County and Essex County. That those are small, but like they eventually solidified, and like so I would call that a rising power. And some powers in Africa. And you had the Dutch, which had like Belgium, which was a complete disaster. That's time for another story. Italy, which was controlling a lot of parts of Ethiopia. There were more, but like the basic idea was a complete mess. At the same time, you had other empires that were crumbling. So, in other words, there was the Austria-Hungary Empire, which contained both what we know as common or current day Austria-Hungary. So I'm just typing these things. And within that, like all of Yugoslavia, which used to be part of actually Yugoslavia, but highly influenced by the Soviet Union. Um, this is complex to explain because it involves all the world. Like when somebody says World War II, it's not just the fact that all the countries were involved, it's the fact that all the countries were involved. It's very, very messy. So within Austria-Hungary, they had all of Yugoslavia, which includes Serbia, um, which at the time was part of Montenegro, and then a unit called Bosnia Herzegovina, Macedonia, which has a different name today, Croatia, and Slovenia. I'm probably missing something, but like all these things were a problem because they all existed different languages and different groups of people, which were controlled by a certain empire. And there was another empire at the time which existed for many hundreds of years, which was the Ottoman Empire. Now, the Ottoman Empire consists of what we know as common day Turkey and parts of Saudi Arabia. There was also there was Iraq, Lebanon, and what I'm going to still call Palestine, Israel. So that was like the Holy Land back then. And I'll show you guys on the map what that means. So The Ottoman Empire was a huge region which the Ottomans were primarily Turkish controlled, but a lot of what people controlled that day wasn't like really controlled. So they had different people in that region who paid taxes to certain empire, but they weren't like fully integrated within them. For example, like in our country, we have different states that pay taxes and are part of the United States of America, but they are integrated within us, even though they're very different. So if you take somebody from New Jersey or Alabama, they're going to have very different views about how things should be run. But essentially, we are part of the same country, but we do have different laws. Say in New Jersey, you can freely walk around with a joint. In Alabama, you can't. In Alabama, you can't have a sex toy. Like you can't buy a vibrator in Alabama. That's how different the laws are. Whereas here, like nobody would think anything of that, but they are very different. So at the end of World War One, which is a complete disaster of all these countries, like everything you see on the screen right now, all these countries did not get along. They all the basic idea of World War One is that I like to phrase it as this, and it seems very lewd, but like it is the truth. World War One was the idea that my dick is bigger than your dick. That's how all these countries on the left, Britain, French, Germany, and all those, like they felt that way in the Ottoman Empire. So they all fought because of power. And even the United States hesitated to get into this world war because they didn't see where they stood. There wasn't a good like idea of good versus evil. It wasn't like Britain, France, and Russia and stuff were the good people. I didn't even mention Russia in here, but those are part of the allies. It wasn't this idea that those three nations, those powerful nations, were good and the other ones are bad. It was more like, what the hell do we do? Who's good? Who's bad? Because there were many people of German descent and many people of English descent on opposite sides getting involved in the war, so nobody knew who's who, and there wasn't a definite evil in World War One. It's different for World War Two. Now, what happened in between these times was what happens when the Ottoman Empire loses. So there were three nations, three big countries that won during the First World War. So I'm going to say the First World War, you had these guys who were the winners. So you had the British Empire, and you also had the French Empire. And then late into the war, the very last part of the war, you had the United States. Again, very complex, which is why a lot of times this is not like explained. So that was the First World War. Those were the Allies. Now on the opposite world of that, so you had not world, so opposite world of World War One was the German Empire. The German Empire lost a lot. They lost a lot of their people, a lot of deaths, a lot of their machinery, everything. Right. So there was the Germans. There was also Austria-Hungary. And the Austria-Hungary Empire lost so much that it ceased to become a thing. So Austria-Hungary got broken into like 8 different countries at the time. You also had Italy. Italy was kind of on both sides of the war. They were a part of the Central Powers, which was kind of the bad guys, and then they deflected and became part of the Allied powers. So there's that. But then there was the Ottoman Empire, which you don't hear about a lot because that completely like dissolved. So the Ottoman Empire, the problem was that the other countries needed to be the other countries need to figure out what to do with the empire. Like, so what do we do with these people who have lost? So like there's so many different countries, so many ethnicities. Like even Turkish people do not talk the same language as all the other four listed there: Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, what's so forth. So the Ottoman Empire need to be broken up, and so the Allied powers, the British, French, United States, had to decide how they got divided. Now, whenever another country divides how another country gets divided, there are problems. So let me add that as a separate point. Dividing empires is a problem. So notice I did not mention here the Russian Empire. Russian Empire is a completely different story, and it's a completely different time to explain something else. So Russia was always a place with a problem of land and ethnicity and religion, culture, and ideas and what that all meant. So Russia has always had that problem. So beginning in the early 1600s, where people didn't like even wash and brush their teeth, to kind of finding a place to belong in this like European world. But Russia's also very close to Asia, so they had those ideas too. And so it wound up being that again, I don't want to get too much into all this because like I love talking about this, but like Russia was a mess. When Russia collapsed in 1917, the people of Russia overthrew the government of Russia so much to the extent that they withdrew from World War I and formed their own thing, which is known as the Soviet Union, which is an amazing power block which existed for the last like 60 years and exists to this day. And their problems still exist from that also involve Israel to a minor extent, but I'm not going to try to like forget those things for a while. So but the biggest thing here, I just realized that, but divining. Let me go to that. Dividing right here. So they divided the empires. Now, when another country divides another landmass, there's always problems because the other country doesn't have the same ideas as the people in this country as to what to do the best. So I'm going to end this video right here and for the next video, like what happens when those areas were divided and what happened since. And I know this is like very confusing, a lot of information, so just let me like know if you have questions on like what I'm talking about here.